For 20 years, every single argument against renewable energy came down to one thing: storing electricity costs too much. That was the wall. Solar got cheap, wind got cheap, but the sun goes down and the wind stops. For 2 decades, that meant you still needed coal or gas to keep the lights on at night. The fossil fuel industry leaned on this harder than anything else. They called it the intermittency problem. They talked about base load. They drew curves showing how solar power drops right when people need power the most. And for a long time, they were right. But something happened recently that quietly ends that whole argument. It comes from a company most people think of as a car maker, not a power company. BYD is the Chinese company that already makes more electric cars than anyone else on Earth. Now they have been working on a battery that almost nobody in Western energy circles is talking about yet. The headline number is $40 per kilowatt hour, but the real number, the one that actually matters, is closer to $20 when you look at how long this battery lasts. That is the magic number. It is the point where solar stops being cheap power sometimes and becomes cheap power all the time, day and night. If you are enjoying videos like this, please hit the like button because it takes a lot of effort to make these. And subscribe so you do not miss the next one. What makes this story so amazing is not just the price. It is the science behind it, the materials it uses, and the way it breaks down almost every argument that has kept fossil fuels on the grid for decades. To understand why a $20 battery changes everything, you first need to understand what the argument against renewables was and why it lasted so long. The argument that held renewables back. For most of the last 20 years, if you asked anyone in the energy world why we could not run everything on solar and wind, you would get the same answer. The sun does not shine at night. The wind does not blow on demand. Electricity has to be used the moment it is made, or it has to be stored, and storing it was very expensive. This was not a small problem. It was the biggest thing blocking a fully renewable grid. Think of it like a farmer who grows more food than anyone could eat at harvest time, but has no fridge. The food is great, but if you cannot keep it fresh, you still go hungry in winter. Solar panels can flood the grid with cheap power at noon, but by 6 in the evening, when everyone gets home, plugs in their electric car, turns on the air conditioning, and puts the kettle on, the panels are making almost nothing. Energy people have a name for this. They call it the duck curve. In the middle of the day, solar makes so much power that grid operators actually have to pay people to take the extra electricity, or they just shut the panels off. Then a few hours later, demand spikes hard and fast. The grid scrambles to fire up gas plants to cover the gap. Those gas plants are called peaker plants. They exist for only one reason. They run a few hundred hours a year during the evening rush. They burn gas to keep the lights on. They cost a lot, they are dirty, and until now, they were needed. The whole fossil fuel argument rested on this gap. You can build all the solar you want, they would say, but you still need us for when the sun goes down. And for 20 years that was true. Batteries cost too much to fill that gap at scale. A grid battery that stores solar power for nighttime use had to compete with the cost of just burning gas. For a long time, gas won easily. Every argument came from that one fact. What about a cloudy week? What about winter? What about baseload? None of these were really science problems. They were money problems dressed up as science problems. If storage were cheap enough, you could just build more solar, store the extra, and get through cloudy weeks and winter months on batteries. The math worked. The money did not. That is the whole story. The tools to run a grid on renewables have existed for years. What was missing was a battery cheap enough and long-lasting enough to make the math work. And that brings us to what changed, and why it changed so fast that most of the energy world has not caught up yet. How solar got cheap enough to change the game. To understand why the storage breakthrough matters so much, you need to know what happened to the price of making electricity from the sun. Since 2010, the cost of solar panels has dropped by about 90%. That is not a slow decline, that is a cliff. In the best places on Earth, spots with lots of sun and cheap land, solar now makes electricity for under 2 cents per kilowatt hour. That makes it the cheapest form of power humans have ever made. Cheaper than coal, cheaper than gas, cheaper than nuclear, cheaper than anything we have ever built. This happened because solar panels got better and cheaper at the same time. Factories in China scaled up to levels nobody imagined 20 years ago. Every time global production doubled, the cost of panels dropped by about 20%. That snowball effect turned solar from a pricey niche thing into the default choice for new power plants in most of the world. But cheap power alone does not solve the timing problem. If anything, it makes it worse. When solar floods the grid at midday, the price of electricity can actually go negative. Utilities pay people to use power because there is too much of it. Then the sun sets, production crashes, and the same grid that was drowning in electricity 3 hours ago is now scrambling to find enough power for evening demand. This is where curtailment comes in. Curtailment is when a solar farm has to switch off its panels because there is nowhere for the electricity to go. The grid cannot take it, batteries are too expensive to store it, and so the energy is just wasted. In California alone, millions of kilowatt hours of solar power are thrown away every year. The sun is shining, the panels are working, and nobody can use the power. At today's storage costs, that waste flips into a strategy. Instead of throwing away midday solar, you store it. You put it in batteries and release it at 6 in the evening when people need it. The solar power is already almost free. The only question is whether the battery is cheap enough to hold it until evening. And that is the number that changes everything. Around $20 per kilowatt hour of storage, priced over the full life of the equipment. Get close to that number, and solar stops being cheap power some of the time and becomes power you can use all of the time. It beats coal, gas, and nuclear for all 24 hours of the day, not just at noon. That one number wipes out almost every technical argument the fossil fuel industry has used for a decade. But for years, nobody could get close to $20. Lithium-ion batteries, the kind in phones and laptops and electric cars, were too expensive and did not last long enough for grid storage. The chemistry was wrong for the job. Something new was needed, and it was going to come from a direction nobody expected. The sodium revolution nobody saw coming. Most people think of batteries and think of lithium. Lithium is in our phones, our laptops, our electric cars. It is the element that powered the mobile revolution. But lithium has problems. It is not everywhere. It is found in just a few countries. The supply chain involves cobalt and nickel, which are even harder to get. And for grid storage, where you need huge amounts of battery power parked next to power plants, lithium was always going to be too expensive to scale up. Enter sodium. Sodium is element number 11 on the periodic table, sitting right below lithium. It acts in a similar way, which means you can build batteries with it using the same basic ideas. But sodium comes from salt. Ordinary salt, the kind that fills the oceans. There is enough sodium in the world to build every battery anyone could ever need, and nobody controls the supply because salt is everywhere. For years, sodium-ion batteries were a lab curiosity. They worked, but not well enough. The energy density was lower than lithium, meaning a sodium battery had to be bigger and heavier to hold the same amount of power. That made them useless for phones and a hard sell for cars. But for grid storage, nobody cares about weight. A battery sitting in a warehouse next to a substation does not need to be light. It needs to be cheap, safe, and long-lasting. This is where BYD comes in. BYD is not just a car company. It is one of the biggest battery makers on Earth, and it has been quietly working on a sodium-ion chemistry built just for grid storage. The chemistry is called a polyanion design, built around a phosphate framework. The key point is that BYD picked this particular chemistry for very specific reasons. The polyanion design is very stable. In abuse testing where batteries are pushed until they fail, these sodium cells peaked at 273 degrees Celsius. A competing sodium chemistry hit 484 degrees under the same test, almost 80% hotter. The polyanion cells also let out less gas when they failed, about 93 liters versus 123 liters for the competing design. When you pack thousands of cells into a sealed building next to a power plant, a chemistry that runs cooler and lets out less gas is not a nice bonus. It is a must. BYD built this chemistry into a large format cell, 189 amp-hours at 2.9 volts. The raw polyanion material does not conduct electricity well on its own, almost like an insulator. So the engineers shrank the particles to about 100 nanometers and coated every single one in carbon. Together, those two tricks lifted conductivity by 100,000 times. That is not a small improvement. That is a huge change in how the material works. The result is a battery that is not trying to win awards for energy density. It is built to sit in a warehouse, charge and discharge every single day for 30 years and never catch fire. And that is exactly what the grid needs. The math that makes $40 behave like $20. Here is where the story gets really good. BYD has set a target of making these sodium cells at about $40 per kilowatt hour by 2027. For context, the cheapest lithium iron phosphate cells on the market today, which are already the main chemistry for grid storage, cost between $55 and $70 per kilowatt hour. So on sticker price alone, BYD is beating lithium by a solid margin. But sticker price is not the real story. Lifespan is. BYD rates this sodium platform for more than 10,000 charge cycles. A rival sodium maker claims over 15,000 cycles on a similar chemistry. In theory, that could mean more than 30 years of daily use. A typical lithium iron phosphate grid cell today is rated around 4,000 to 5,000 cycles. That is roughly half the lifespan, sometimes less. Now think about this the way a grid operator would. You do not buy batteries based on cost per cell. You buy them based on cost per cycle. How much does it cost you to store and release 1 kilowatt hour of electricity every day for the whole life of the battery? That is the number that matters. Run the math. A $40 battery lasting 10,000 cycles delivers energy at the same lifetime cost as a $20 battery lasting only 5,000 cycles. On a cost per cycle basis, BYD's $40 sodium cell acts like a $20 lithium cell. And if the lifespan pushes to 15,000 or even 20,000 cycles, which is possible in mild climates where the batteries are not exposed to extreme heat, the effective cost drops even further. It could get close to $12 or $10 per kilowatt hour. That is the number that changes everything. Remember, $20 per kilowatt hour was the point where solar stops being cheap sometimes and becomes power you can use around the clock. BYD is not shipping at $20. They are shipping at $40, but the battery lasts twice as long, which means the cost per cycle is the same. The economics are the same. The argument is broken either way. For lithium battery makers to match this, they would not just need to cut prices in half to $40, they would need to reach $20 per kilowatt hour while keeping their current lifespan. Nobody is close to that. Nobody at all. The lithium supply chain has been fine-tuned for years, and prices have already been pushed near the floor. There is no clear way to cut lithium cell costs in half while doubling cycle life. Looked at across the industry, this means grid battery prices could fall somewhere in the range of 60 to 65% over the next 18 months. That is not a slow decline. That is a step change. It is the kind of price drop that rewrites the economics of the entire electricity grid in one move, and it leaves every other storage chemistry scrambling to catch up. The bottleneck nobody talks about. The one part of the sodium battery supply chain that is not ready yet is the anode. Most sodium-ion cells use something called hard carbon for the anode, and that supply chain is still very young. Production is spread across small makers with no standard process. Yields vary wildly from one factory to the next. The quality is not consistent, and the volume is nowhere near what it needs to be for grid-scale use. This is a real problem, but it is the kind of problem that gets solved fast when there is money behind it. The hard carbon anode is not limited by raw materials. It is limited by manufacturing knowledge and scale. Both of those things can be built quickly when the demand is there, and the demand is about to be huge. Minmetal Securities, which put together the abuse testing data on these cells, is blunt about the timeline. Their analysts say sodium will not reach true cost parity with lithium iron phosphate until 2027 at the earliest. But that is their forecast. BYD's own targets are more aggressive, and BYD has a track record of hitting cost targets that outside analysts said were impossible. CATL, the other Chinese battery giant, believes that about 40% of the world's batteries made within a few years will be sodium-ion. That is a huge number when you think about the fact that sodium batteries barely existed outside labs a few years ago. The speed of this shift is what catches most people off guard. Inside China's battery market, the competition is already forming around a split. CATL still leads overall, holding about 46.7% of China's battery market, with about 33 gigawatt-hours installed in May alone. BYD sits second at around 16.8%. Rather than competing head-on, the two giants appear to be dividing the field. CATL is pushing sodium chemistry into cars. They already launched a mass-produced car running a 45 kilowatt-hour sodium-ion battery pack through the automaker Chang'an. BYD, on the other hand, is focusing its sodium work on grid-scale storage. That does not make the rivalry friendly. Both companies are racing hard to bring sodium-ion costs down first. But it does suggest that lithium and high-nickel batteries will keep their grip on long-range electric cars for the next 2 or 3 years, while polyanion sodium takes over the heavy stationary role where weight does not matter at all and price per cycle is everything. The supply chain for sodium is also different from lithium in one big way. Sodium comes from salt. There is no cobalt, no nickel, no rare earth elements. The argument that China controls the lithium supply chain, which has been a big concern for Western governments, falls apart at almost the same moment the intermittency argument does. Cheap, reliable power becomes possible anywhere there is sun and salt, which turns out to be almost every place on Earth. What happens when the grid goes renewable? Put the pieces together. Record low solar costs, with panels making electricity for under 2 cents per kilowatt hour. Sodium chemistry approaching $40 per kilowatt hour, with double the cycle life of lithium. A supply chain that needs no lithium, no cobalt, no nickel, and a battery that can sit in a warehouse next to a substation for 30 years without catching fire. The path forward is hard to avoid. Peaker plants, those gas turbines that exist only to run a few hundred hours a year during demand spikes, lose their reason to exist the moment batteries can do the same job quietly for less money. There is no scenario where a gas plant that runs 400 hours a year beats a battery that charges on free midday solar and releases power at 6 in the evening. The battery is cheaper to build, cheaper to run, needs no fuel, and produces no pollution. Baseload coal and gas plants get stuck as their usage drops. A coal plant that used to run 24 hours a day starts losing money when solar beats it during the day and batteries beat it at night. The plant still has to pay for upkeep, for fuel, for workers, but it is selling less and less electricity. Eventually, it becomes cheaper to shut it down than to keep it running. For utilities and for oil exporting countries, that is a big financial hit, and it is a very big deal. Curtailment, the practice of throwing away extra solar because there is nowhere to store it, flips from a waste problem into a money-making strategy. You stop throwing away midday solar and you store it, because storing it is now cheaper than burning gas to cover the gap later. Every extra panel you build becomes an asset, not a problem. The "what about a cloudy week" argument sounds like a science problem, but it is just math. You build more solar capacity, which is now very cheap. You add some wind, which is also cheap. And you store the extra, which is now also cheap. Volume solves the reliability question, and volume just got a lot more affordable. Oil will still be needed for plastics and a few other uses, but the amount of oil, coal, and gas burned for electricity looks set to shrink a lot over the next 5 years. Not slowly, not over decades. In a window of about 5 years, the economics of making electricity from fossil fuels go from hard to impossible to justify. This is what happens when a $20 battery shows up. Not a $20 sticker price, but a $20 effective cost per kilowatt hour when you factor in lifespan. Every argument against renewables, every technical objection, every cloudy week scenario, every baseload question, all of it goes back to the cost of storage, and that cost just collapsed. If you liked this story and want to see more like it, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. There are related videos on the screen right now if you want to keep watching. So here is a question for you. If batteries become cheap enough to store solar power for weeks at a time, what do you think happens to the fossil fuel industry? Let me know in the comments.